Hi, Crimies. I'm your host, M.A.B, and you're listening to the Coffee and Crime podcast. Today's case is insane, so brace yourself because we're going to be together for a long minute. So feel free to pause this to grab a drink, a snack, put the leash on your dog to go for a long walk, whatever you see fit, but you've been warned. So, as usual, before I say anything more, take a listen to the following disclaimer.
The content delivered through this podcast will at times be graphic in nature and describe criminal conduct which includes but is not limited to violence, sexual assault, and homicide. All suspects described in the podcast are considered innocent until they are found guilty in a court of law. I'm not an expert on any subjects covered, I'm just an interested party. The content will be troubling and upsetting to some people, therefore, viewer or listener discretion is advised.
So, as part of my research for this case, not only did I read multiple news articles and listen to many podcasts, which is something I normally do for each case, but I also printed and went through hundreds of pages of court documents to make sure that I had a really solid understanding of the case and as much information as possible to be able to give it to you. On that note, welcome to episode 7, Allan Legere. Allan Legere was a petty criminal and mechanic, and he was born on February 13th of 1948 to Louise Legere, father unknown. He grew up in Chatham Head, Miramichi, and Miramichi used to be referred to as the Miramichi because it was sort of made up of a bunch of little kind of communities together in the same area. They eventually dropped and it just became known as Miramichi in 1995 when it was established as a city. The primary communities, I'm sorry, I'm going to massacre one of them, I know it, but the primary communities are known as Newcastle, Chatham, Douglastown, Logieville, and Nelson. Logieville is the one I'm not really sure of, so pardon my pronunciation. So back to Chatham Head, where Allan grew up, it was a really poor part of town, and some residents even struggled to make monthly rent payments, utilities, heat, food, etc. Not that that doesn't apply today or it doesn't happen today, but it was really common for most of the residents in that poor little area. As a matter of fact, it was such a sketchy place that people even avoided walking or biking through there. That's how rough it was. His mom, Louise, started renting rooms in the house to try to help bring in extra money to help, provide for the family. And that's when one of the renters ended up fathering Allan, but then he skipped town and was basically never seen or heard of after. So he never knew his dad. Later, his older brother was killed when he was walking on a local bridge and he got run over by a vehicle. From that day on, Louise, his mom, was always just so full of resentment towards Allan, and after the accident, she never missed an opportunity to remind Allan that she wished it was him that died instead of his brother. And even though this certainly does not excuse his behavior, I get that. How traumatic is it to hear this come from your own mother? It would leave deep emotional scars, I'm sure of it. So let's go forward to 1987 when Allan was 38 years old and he was convicted for his role in the 1986 murder of Mary and John Glendinning. John and Mary were elderly and they owned like a little grocery store in Black River Bridge, New Brunswick. They were very well known in the community and they were liked by everyone. And through my research, I finally understood that the grocery store was on the main level and then they lived on the upper level. So both were connected and they didn't have to go really far to get home or to get to work, either way. So June 21st, 1986, it's a Saturday, John and Mary closed the store and they head home upstairs to grab just a little bedtime snack before they head to bed and before they get some much-deserved rest. Suddenly, though, John hears a commotion and unfamiliar noises downstairs in the store. So he kind of yells something out like, "Hey, what's going on down there?" And almost at the same time, three men come busting through the front door. They tell the couple they want access to the safe. So after beating John severely, they tell Mary to take them to the safe. And then she does. But before she can even get the safe open, she gets badly beaten, just like John. The only difference is that she's sexually violated on top of the beating. So after she received a few hard blows to the head, she's unconscious, knocked out. The men just took the safe and took it with them, which is probably why they didn't really need to wait for Mary to actually open it, because their intention was to grab it and take off with it. So later on, Mary wakes up kind of confused, not really sure how she even ended up in her bedroom. And she's barely even able to crawl to make it to a phone to be able to call for help. But when the police get there, they're shocked by the absolutely insane amount of blood they see. There's blood everywhere. The walls, the floor, the ceiling. As a matter of fact, it's even dripping from the ceiling. When they go in, they find Mary, who's barely unconscious, and she's beaten so badly and she's so bloody that she's literally unrecognizable. Like, responders didn't even know, and they weren't even sure if Mary was going to make it through the night. That's how bad it was. So they start looking through the house to find John because they just can't find him until they find him slumped over behind the bedroom door. He had a shirt tied around his neck so tight that it even crushed his Adam's apple. John was declared dead, and Mary was taken to the hospital to be treated for her injuries. So while police are investigating the crime scene, they end up gathering some evidence. And later, an anonymous tip comes into the police department, and the tipster offers information saying that Todd Matchett, 18 years old, Scott Curtis, 20 years old, and Allan Legere, 38 years old, were all implicated in the crime. So Allan gets arrested, and then Todd and Curtis escape to Quebec, but they eventually get found there not too long after, and they get arrested there. So Scott and Curtis are found guilty of the murder and beating, and they both get sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility after 16 years. Allan gets the same charge and the same sentence. However, he would only be eligible for parole after 18 years. So he gets 2 more years before he can apply for parole. So now Allan is incarcerated in a maximum security prison in Renouse, New Brunswick. But the administration was never advised that during the Glendenning trial, Allan had managed to pick the lock of his handcuffs and leg shackles, and he had made a failed attempt to escape. After this attempted escape, Allan was put in segregation, so basically he was kept separate from the other inmates. During his incarceration, he was kind of a model prisoner, never causing trouble, always respectful, and he always respected the guards to the point where they kind of became friendly. So there was kind of a, I guess, like a level of trust there that probably shouldn't have been there. But Allan was very charming, and this was clearly part of a bigger plan. So this now brings us to May 3rd, 1989. Allan always had ear infections, and for all the parents out there, you know that the more infections they get, it's almost like the worse they get too. Like, they just hurt, they don't go away, it's crazy stuff. So because he always had ear infections, the prison decided to make an appointment for him with a specialist at the Georges Dumont Hospital in Moncton. What they didn't know was that Allan would use metal objects to scrape the inside of his ears, and he would even pour urine in his ears to cause the infections. That's a whole new level of gross for me. He tells the guards he needs to use the washroom once they get to the hospital, and the guard lets him go and stands on the other side of the door. So you can kind of picture it, it's like a single stall. So he goes in, closes the door, and the guard is standing guard, no pun intended, on the other side. So then Allan opens the door slightly and tells the guard he needs more toilet paper. And this is literally just so that he gets a few minutes to himself, fully unsupervised. Now, sorry in advance for people like my mom and I who are very visual, but Allan had hidden a collapsed TV antenna in his rectum and a piece of metal inside a cigar to unlock his cuffs and leg shackles. It's said that they did do a strip search before he was taken to the hospital, and they did a cavity search and the whole, bend and cough. But I'm sure it's not normal for prisoners to carry and hide cigars up their rectums. Was it just missed, maybe? Kind of odd. So, anyway, he kicks the door open and starts waving the antenna and bolts for the parking lot. And this is when he jumps in the first car he sees and takes off with the car and Peggy Olive, who's also inside her vehicle. He drives Peggy's vehicle to an area he's familiar with in Moncton, ditches the car, and lets Peggy go too. Then he vanishes and remains under the radar for some time. Next, I'm taking you to May 28th in a small town called Chatham, which is a town on the Miramichi River. Emergency services get dispatched to a house fire. This is the home of Annie Flam, 75 years old, and her sister-in-law, Nina Flam, 61 years old. Yes, I did my research. I thought her name was Nina because I know a few Ninas and that's how it's spelled, but it is definitely pronounced Nina. Annie and Nina were also known in their small community because they are also owners of a small grocery store in the same area. So when emergency services get there, they find the upper part of the home engulfed in flames. When the firefighters enter the home, they find Nina half unconscious at the bottom of the stairs. And they also find Annie's remains in her bedroom. Annie's face was so badly beaten, and even her jaw was broken, so you can tell this was a violent attack. She didn't die of smoke inhalation, as one would think, but because she ended up choking on her own vomit. So now we start to see a pattern because both women, are badly beaten. Both are also sexually violated. And the investigators were able to confirm that someone had broken in and deliberately set the house on fire, hoping it would destroy any evidence left behind. So remember earlier when I said the investigators were searching the scene and gathering evidence? Well, they collected some hair and semen they found. But the catch is that DNA testing at the time was still so new and in the very, very early stages, and the first testing facility in Toronto wasn't even open yet. So even though there were a lot of similarities between the two cases, they couldn't prove yet that Allan was the common denominator. Anyway, so one day this contractor is doing his landscaping not far from a house where a couple had scared off a burglar the night before, and he finds a pair of men's sunglasses. Here's the thing. When Allan escaped, he was wearing glasses that were identical to the ones the landscaper found. At this point, there's still no way to tie Allan to the crimes, so Crime Stoppers steps in and they offer a $2,000 reward for any information or tips that will lead to Allan's arrest. Unfortunately, Allan's crime spree doesn't end there. So the next crime takes us to Newcastle. Now it's September 30th, and Morrissey Doran, who's 70 years old, gets shot in the back when he confronts an intruder in his house. And that's still not it by a long shot. The next day, an armed person breaks into yet another home in Newcastle. And this was the home of Edwin and Evangeline Russell. This pair was also viciously assaulted. So I think it's obvious by now that Allan preyed mostly on the elderly and on women. And I would imagine it's because he knew they'd be easy to overpower, and this made him feel powerful and in control. He's a stocky guy, not fat by any means. Like, he actually worked out to keep in shape, but you can tell he's just like stocky. So on October 14th, around 7:35 a.m., a volunteer firefighter who was driving by a residence sees smoke coming from the residence. So this was the home of Linda Donnie, who was 41 years old, and Donna Donnie, 45 years old. Here's the weird thing. When the police get to the scene, they find one of the sisters tucked in her bed. She was deceased, and she had second and third degree burns covering her entire body. But it's just weird how Allan didn't just throw her in bed. He took the time to neatly tuck her into her bed. It's kind of creepy. And you guessed it, both women were severely beaten and sexually violated. So again, this crime scene was eerily similar to the previous ones. Again, fits the pattern. Then, just to add to the police's suspicion that this could potentially all be linked to Allan, they find out that years prior, Allan and Linda had actually dated. So by now, everyone in Miramichi is freaking out. And a lot of people who lived alone, especially elderly people and women, were bunking up with family so they wouldn't have to be left alone in their own homes. Some people paid to have extra streetlights installed because, from what I understand in my research, streetlights were like every second house. So they were paying to get streetlights installed between the other streetlights. So there would be one at each house. And everyone, or mostly everyone, was leaving their porch lights on at night. And they were hoping that this would encourage Allan to go somewhere else. Like, just don't pick my house. It's not dark here. Go somewhere else. They even called them Allan lights at some point. So that says a lot. So that year in Newcastle, Halloween was even held at different community centers and different areas in the community to help and protect the kids by not having them trick or treat outside door to door at night. At this point, Crime Stoppers steps in again and they bump the original reward of $2,000 up to $10,000. In a small community where no one ever locked their doors, now consumed by fear, everyone did. Now, I want to take you to November 16th, 1989. Father James Smith, a Roman Catholic priest, is nowhere to be found at 7 p.m. when services are supposed to begin at the Blessed Virgin Mary Church in Chatham Head. So he lives in the rectory next to the church, and when he fails to show up, and he's even a little bit late, some of his parishioners went to the rectory to check on him. This is when they found Father Smith severely beaten and lifeless. There was blood in many rooms of the house, but the main attacks seem to have taken place in the kitchen and the office, including bloody footprints throughout the house, and Father Smith's car was also missing. It was later discovered that the boot imprints matched the ones found near Father Smith's abandoned car at a Keddy's Motel in Bathurst, New Brunswick. Man, he got around. An autopsy also later confirmed that Father Smith had been kicked, pounded over a few hours, and that Allan even jumped on his chest, causing his ribs to separate from the sternum. Allan had spent the day inside the rectory, ate the food there, had a few drinks, changed his clothes, and even answered the phone when it rang. He just told whoever called that they had the wrong number. Wow. Now, again, as police keep searching for solid tips that could link Allan to all these crimes, Crime Stoppers steps in one more time and increases their reward to $50,000. And I must say that today it's a decent amount. It's a chunk of change. So back in 1989, it's a substantial amount of money. But even with this increase, they can't find Allan. A week later, on November 23rd, around 10 p.m., a younger taxi driver is parked by a bar in St. John, New Brunswick, waiting for someone to hop in so he can make some money. A man flags him down and says he wants to get dropped off in a town a little over an hour away. So he calls dispatch just to see roughly how much the cost would be for that fare, and dispatch answers that it would be about $100. So when the cab driver turns to the man and tells him it's going to be about $100, he sees the man in the back seat pointing a sawed-off shotgun. Allan tells him who he is and that he's the one they're looking for. And while he's talking, he's telling the driver to go faster and faster. The snow's coming down hard and there's ice on the roads. And while the cabbie doesn't feel comfortable driving faster on the icy roads, the guy has a gun, right? So at one point, he passes a transport truck, loses control of the car and ends up front bumper in a snowbank. They're still able to get out of the car, and Allan makes the cab driver walk with him while they wait for the next vehicle to pass by so they can try to flag it and hitch a ride. That's when, around midnight, an off-duty police officer, Michelle Mercer, pulls over. I mean, she sees the car in the ditch and the two men walking, so she stops to help and offer them a ride. But as the men get in the car, she starts to feel sort of uneasy, and that's when she decides to tell them that she's a member of the RCMP. That's when Allan, sitting in the passenger seat, pulls out his gun and tells her who he is. And then he demands that she bring him to Moncton. She tells Allan she has to stop for gas or they're not going to make it anywhere because she doesn't have enough gas to even get to Moncton. So Allan agrees. So they pull into the gas station where Allan gets out of the car, gun in hand. He pumps the gas and he even goes in to pay, but not before he takes the keys out of the vehicle. So once he's inside the store, Michelle looks at the cab driver and she says, "Hey, I have a spare set of keys. Are we just bolting out of here?" And the cab driver was like, "Yes, ma'am." So they sort of fishtail out of the parking lot. But while they're doing that, Allan sees the two people leaving the parking lot and he's like, "Man, I have no ride. I have to hide." So he runs and hides between two transport trucks. So when police arrive at the scene after being called by Michelle, because she actually made it to the nearest police station and she called for help from there, they can't find Allan anywhere. But that's because he finds a transport truck driver, draws his gun again, and tells him who he is. And initially, the truck driver doesn't even recognize him because he looks nothing like the flyers and the pictures that have been circulating. The truck driver finally decides that he doesn't really have a choice. So nonetheless, he's been told to drive and he does just that because he has a gun pointed at him. Another truck driver that was in that parking lot finds it kind of weird that the truck is headed for a side road because it's just not the normal route that a truck would take, a transport truck would take. So because he finds it so odd, he ends up radioing the fact that there's something weird going on. He's got a gut feeling. So finally, on November 24th, after a 201-day manhunt on Route 118, police finally see the truck in front of them. They pull the truck over, and Allan steps out, throws his weapon to the ground, quietly surrenders, and says, "You got me." I think he went quietly because, unlike his crimes, I think he knew that there was no chance for him to win this fight. So later in 1991, police can finally link Allan to the Flam, Donnie, and Smith murders thanks to the DNA lab in Toronto, which was finally in service. So because of DNA, police were able to confirm Allan was not responsible for the Morrissey Doran murder or the murders of Edwin and Evangeline either. Thankfully, Allan was found guilty of 4 murders, and this case was one of the first cases that used DNA evidence to actually convict a criminal, which is kind of amazing. So out of all the crappy things that this case has brought, there was one good thing at least. So he was classified as a dangerous offender, and he was also considered likely to reoffend. In 2015, he was transferred to the maximum security prison called Edmonton Institution in Alberta. A jury deliberated for 13 hours before finding Allan guilty of first-degree murder on all 4 counts. So he was sentenced to life in prison without eligibility for parole for 25 years, which is the maximum a person can get sentenced for first-degree murder in Canada. And just to sort of recap, this was for the murders of Annie Flam, Donna Donnie, Linda Donnie, and Father James Smith. Allan weirdly took pride in being able to slip into a home at night, take whatever he wanted, and leave without the homeowners knowing he was ever there. That being said, he would always leave a little something to show that he had been there. And once he even cut the panties off a woman in her sleep. Can you freaking imagine waking up like that? Oh, man. He would often take a book from inside the home, open it, leave it on the living room floor, and then ignite the pages. So by the time the rest of the house caught fire, he was long gone. Also, if we go back to Father Smith's murder for a sec, after Allan was done there, he boarded a train that was heading to Quebec. This part really it gets under my skin. So police were told to look for him on the train, and they said he should be easy enough to identify because he had the tattoo of an eagle on his shoulder. So when the police go up to a man that was Allan on the train, they ask him to pull up his sleeve high enough, and there's no tattoo. So they move on. Definitely not this guy. But wait a minute. You only check one arm? Since when? As you've probably guessed by now, if they would have checked the other arm or the other shoulder, they definitely would have found the eagle tattoo on that shoulder. They checked the wrong side. So I wish someone would actually comment on my case and let me know your thoughts because my mom's the only one that actually comments every time. So some people say that his upbringing made him do the things he did. Others say he was just simply born a psychopath. I think I'd probably side more with option B. I mean, I know a lot of people who grew up with rough upbringings and had less than desirable childhoods, and they didn't grow up to kill anyone. So is that really an excuse or a reason? Not so sure. Even today, he has absolutely no remorse for what he's done to those people or any of his actions. And he's even still denying having as much involvement in the crimes he committed. So he's always blaming that somebody else was with him and they did most of whatever happened and he barely had anything to do with it. Come on, Allan. Something else I want to bring up is that even after being incarcerated, he actually had the nerve to make a request to have his TV put back in his cell. Get this. So this time, they took the time to look over the TV really closely, every crack and crevice, everything. And guess what? Hidden inside, they find 2 handcuff keys. So to me, this would be evidence that he was potentially, allegedly, planning another escape. Can you imagine? Anyway, he didn't get his TV back. Hopefully he never does. So Allan's many appeals were denied, and even though he became eligible for day parole in November 2012 and then full parole in November 2015, his request for both was also denied. And then at the parole hearing, Allan said that he did not consider himself as violent or as a sex offender. Clearly, he needs more time and time out in his jail cell. So this was the deep dive of Allan Legere. I learned so much researching this case, especially while going through court documents. So I hope I was able to teach you a thing or two. I actually remember when he escaped, my mom, my grandmother, all of my family was freaked out. I was too young at the time to even understand what that meant or to understand how scary it was to have a man like that on the loose. After reading all this stuff, now I get it. I would have been freaked out too. So if you stayed with me the entire time, thank you so much. I really appreciate you. And again, please don't forget to follow, join, subscribe, share, all of the things. It is literally the only way that I can grow my Crimies family. Don't forget my corny line, crime is a waste of time. And also don't forget to tune in next week for an all-new episode. Bye, Crimies.